Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 2. Hiruzen sighed as he looked over a few of the members of his shinobi council. After everything had been said and done, the members of council had gathered together and they were now poring over everything that could be found in the Okage and Jonin's libraries about the Senju family. This had started at nearly 4 a.m. that morning and it hadn't stopped. While normally he wouldn't allow certain persons such high clearance, he had allowed Shikaku Nara, Shibi Aburame and Murakumo Kurama and Sum Inuzuka. He wasn't about to allow the Hyuga clan or the Uchiha clan into this archive. It would be like asking for the headache from hell. Oi, how about a break, old man? Sum asked. Finally standing, it was roughly the lunch hour and the four of them had been working non-stop. The worst part was when she finally got out of that bent-over position, her back started popping like there was no tomorrow. Shikaku sighed, looking over at his fellow clan head. I must admit, Hokage-san, I was wondering if we could take a break. Quote. Hiruzen chuckled. Haven't I told you before? Hiruzen is just fine, Shikaku. Either way, yes, let's take a break. I suppose most of this shall have to be done in the mornings, won't it? I have more. Hell, the Hokage continued, glaring at the growing pile of paperwork. And I imagine that you all have duties that must be attended to as well. All four members sighed. Sometimes it was no fun being the one in charge, making sure that the finances of both their clans in Konoha. It was something that they all wished they could foist off onto their civilian counterparts, but they all knew that would just give that group of cowards more of an inflated heads than they're currently held at this point. I suppose I should send a note to Jiraiya today as well. Hiruzen finally spoke up as the four heads began to gather their things. It would take them months, possibly years, to be able to get through everything hidden away in the Hokage's library. Not to mention that once Tsunade came home, they might be able to get access to the Senju library. He was relatively sure that was the only way he was going to get the type of information that he wanted. Shikaku blinked. Hasn't he been checking up on Naruto every few months? He finally asked, looking over at the Hokage in surprise. He'd originally assumed that Jiraiya simply came to check up on the seal, but the older the girl got, the more it became apparent that she looked like Kushina, had her other's personality, and her father's brains and coloring. But he'd kept his mouth shut. Minato would have come back from the grave and killed him if Naruto became the toy of some political nightmare. Hiruzen nodded. Indeed, he could only agree, and he honestly didn't have a clue as if Naruto had actually met his pervert of a student. Somehow he tended to doubt it. She would have been up in arms with self-righteous anger about perverts. And he could only laugh internally at the thought of Naruto's hormones being awoken. The clan heads all nodded before shuffling out of the room to give the Hokage the privacy that he seemed to yearn for, though Sum had to wonder if he just wanted to read his porn. If the old man really thought they hadn't figured it out, then he was senile or in denial. Hiruzen watched them go, before going through a practiced hand sequence before a young monkey appeared within his office. Hello, Hajime. Yo, old man, whatcha need? Don't you usually call Gramps? The young white-furred monkey asked, looking at the old human with a curious expression. Hiruzen rolled his eyes. It must the day of old men. This was the 8th time he'd been called that, and it wasn't past 1 yet. I need you to deliver a message for me. Hajime blinked. His dark, intelligent golden eyes seemed to have a hidden question hidden there. Is it for that old perv? Hiruzen snorted his amusement. Yes, Hajime, it's for the old perv. Quote. Meh. I guess I'll give it to Gamakichi then. They aren't so far away and I won't have to hunt that smelly guy down. Hajime huffed lightly, pushing a large amount of air out of his nose in dislike. Honestly, that human male always smelled like, but the gross thing was it was never of his own copulate. Ion. No one in the Monkey Summon clan got it and they didn't want to. Hiruzen sighed, a frustrated expression on his face. Thank you, Hajime, and tell Enma I said thank you. The poof of smoke was all that left at the young white-furred monkey went to do as he was asked. Closing his eyes and trying to ignore the headache that seemed to be exploding at the temple of his head, he sighed, before pulling out his stamp and starting to work on his paperwork. Looking out the window, he sent up a brief prayer for Kakashi and his son, Genma too for that matter. Kakashi had left late the day before, while Genma and Asuma had left at around the same time he'd gotten up to open the Hokage's archives. Oh, Genma and Asuma knew when they left Konohagakure they would have a hard time finding Tsunade, but they never imagined the insanity that would come their way. Oh. NCE they left the confines of the city's barrier and its protection. Apparently they weren't the only ones after Tsunade, and she'd gotten into more than a little bit of trouble, because some of the people trying to collect weren't the sort they could see the busty blonde ever asking money from. Not only that, but Genma was having the same amount of difficulty with this mission as he was. Both of them wanted to return home but for different reasons. Asuma was getting to know a young woman by the name of Kurenai, while Genma was going to be a daddy in the next few weeks. Honestly, it made the elder man freak out at the thought that Suiren, his current love interest, going into labor when he wasn't there. Asuma had to wonder if his father wasn't just trying to get Genma's mind off things. Then again, he didn't blame the older man. He'd sent Kakashi off after Aoi, off all people. Kakashi had hated the pompous younger man, and Asuma had no doubt that Kakashi would be killing him with the precision he was known for in Anbu. He shuddered at the black cold rage that had seemed to surround Kakashi after he'd left the Hokage's office. He was one of few members of Konoha that could get that close to the man when he was in such a state. Guy stated that he'd gone and asked Naruto's two little friends and Iruka, her new teacher, to sit with her while he was gone. Then again, Kakashi did consider the girl to be his little sister-daughter hybrid relationship. The younger man had softened up in the almost month that they had been allowed her to live with him. And that brought Asuma back to the mission at hand. What would Tsunade do once she learned that she had a relative left? Would she try to take Naruto from the village? And if the woman did, what would happen to Kakashi? Not only that, but if Naruto did wake up, how would she react to everything, or would she even be told that she was directly related to 3 of Konoha's 4 Hokages? Asuma, you're thinking out loud again. Genma glared lightly. He was not amused with his current partner's ideas or thoughts. He liked Kakashi happy. He was a lot more fun to get along with. Not only that, but he did indeed want to go back to his girlfriend and see her with her swollen belly. Asuma sighed. Sorry, this is getting a little out of hand. Genma nodded in agreement. I agree, I really don't want to face Tsunade sober or drunk. Both men grimaced at the thought of what the strength-enhanced one woman could do to the two of them. Anyway, how's Suiren? Asuma asked. The two of them had been on the same genin team and they'd stayed friends long afterward. They were part of a group of Junins that were always around the other. Both Guy and Kakashi were part of this group, but both of them tended to prefer Kakashi. He was oh so much calmer. A small, slightly dirty grin ran across the Genma's face. He loved his girlfriend more than one could imagine. While many said horrible things about his lovely lady, the two of them often ignored it. He was 25, she was 18. This happened to be the biggest part of the intention, at least for the civilian side of things. 18. Young and oh so beautiful with her deep black hair and soft gray eyes, he had a hard time not loving her big heart. Not only that, but she had a figure to kill for. They both agree she would stop using the public hot springs mainly because Eid found her figure and face in the comic version of Ika Ika. No one had wanted to kill a white-haired Sanin as much as the two of them. Very, very pregnant, were having twins. Genma grinned happily. Rado and Aoba had been ragging on him like crazy while the rest of his friends had wished him the best. Asuma blinked in surprise and some amusement at the gooey happy face Genma was making, and he had to wonder at the difference a woman like Suiren made on his life. Then again, Asuma knew it had to have taken some time for Suiren to trust anyone. On her first upgraded missions, her Jonin sensei left her behind thinking she was dead. Nearly a month later, she stumbled into Konoha looking broken but having completed the mission that her former teammates had abandoned her on. So boys or girls, or both? Asuma finally asked, soaring through the trees beside Genma. It seemed like they had been running for hours and both members were getting tired, not to mention they'd run between asking about Tsunade through the few villages they had passed and the occasionally enemy ninja things had been going SMO. Oathly, but neither men could find rest, both felt the quiet before the storm. Genma shrugged. Sui didn't want to know, said she wanted a surprise. I don't really care what we have as long as the three of them are healthy at the end of it. It was a solemn comment, one that Asuma could understand well. Many kunoichi had a hard time conceiving and an even harder time carrying the baby to full term. It was why women like Makoto Uchiha and Yoshino Nara retired after giving birth. A sudden noise to their right stopped all conversation. Both men paused before they seemed to simply blend in with the background. Two men with strange headbands seemed to be moving about. Both seemed to be looking for something in particular, but what it was couldn't be seen. Nay, Jiro, why are we going after these bastards? The darker-haired male asked. He was a chunin and damned good at what he did. Suichi, shut the hell up. Jiro replied. His bald head was covered in a thick bandana that had the metal plate of his village. He was a big hulking man, larger than the Sanin Jiraiya and built very much like a rock. Muscles seemed to ripple with every move the man made. One would assume that the man was slow, but you could tell by his light and quiet movements that he had speed and strength on his side of a taijutsu fight. Suichi huffed as he looked toward his partner. He didn't understand why he needed to be quiet. He couldn't feel anyone about. Cold, vibrant green eyes glared. He hated being told what to do, but Jiro so rarely gave him an order that he really couldn't be mad. Nay, Jiro. Come on, at least tell me what this is all about. Suichi climbed on the back of the big man, happy to hang from the thickly muscled man. Jiro sighed in frustration. Apparently Orochimaru-sama's experiment survived. Quote. A frown fell over the younger man's face. Which one? He left several in Konoha, including that moron Mizuki. It was a feminine face. Suichi was one of the best at seduction, be they man or woman, even if he preferred big beefy man meat like Jiro. Jiro snorted softly in scorn. None of Orochimaru's soldiers could stand the double-crossing spy, the boy with the ability of Mokuten. He's supposedly a child that had been grafted with the DNA of Hashirama. It's nothing short of a miracle that the thing survived. More importantly, according to one of our sources, a child has rewaked the Mokuten. A child naturally related to Hashirama. Orochimaru-sama wants him or her. Jiro shrugged. He honestly didn't care. Bah, that's not why we were called in. Suichi replied coolly, before his green eyes went wide before they began to die. Two Senbon needles were thrust through his neck. Blood tricked down in a virtual river. Another was thrust through his esophagus. It pinned the two sides together at his spinal cord. Jiro was no better. Several kunai littered his neck, ensuring that the big man died. Both Konoha ninja re-emerged from the trees, both frowning. From what the Hokage had told them, only the hospital staff and clan heads knew anything about Naruto, let alone Yamato. Within seconds, both leaf ninja moved from where they'd emerged, both holding up a simple hand seal before dispelling the genjutsu. Jiro. They tried to kill me in a horrible way. The small man pouted, cuddled up against his partner's chest, faux tears pouring down his flushed childish cheeks. Now Suichi, I suppose we'll just have to repay them, no? The big man grinned, his sharply planned face cruel and excited at the thought of destroying them. He recognized one of them very well. We seem to have a little fire guardian. Why don't I play with him? Nay. You can get daddy. Maybe we can get daddy's babies and wifey after everything's over with. She sounds like a good breeding toy. Suichi pouted slightly, before an amused expression took over his face. Can I keep daddy too? I need to practice. Yes. Jiro chuckled. Sure, why not? He had no doubts in his mind that Suichi would rape the man over and over again. They were both sick bastards that way. Genma felt his blood run cold. Suiren was in a vulnerable condition and he wasn't about to let some sick bastard touch WH. As was his soft chocolate eyes became hard. As he focused on the smaller man, he could feel Asuma beside him coiling up ready for the fight to get started. There was a similar calm rage in the man's heart and he could understand it. Yamato was another dear friend. The thought that Orochimaru was interested in the young man and the young child Naruto was a terrifying thought. Asuma was off his trench knives ready as he studied his opponent. This fellow was bigger than him and he didn't recognize the man in any bingo book he'd seen. Then again he didn't recognize the music note on the man's headband either. So where you from? Asuma asked with a cool that he didn't feel. Jiro chuckled. I suppose I could tell you. Thick arms were covered in plates of steel, while short daggers were held within the man's hands. He lashed out aiming for Asuma's stomach. Asuma jumped up again away. Using his control he attached himself to a tree before a earth-shattering kick splintered the tree. Using a cat-like grace that was rarely seen, Asuma twisted in air to drag his wind-covered trench knives over the huge bastard's shoulders. Blood splurged forward, before Asuma was slammed backwards by a large forearm. Landing on his feet and sliding backwards, he had to catch his breath from the sharp pain that seemed to resonate in his chest. Asuma looked up, and took a grim satisfaction in watching the blood spew over Jiro's chest, soaking his mesh suit. The bigger man was grinned like a madman and it made Asuma wonder what he could be thinking. Just as suddenly the two of them disappeared, the wind in the area seemed to pick up before several blue flashes seemed to rise up. The blue flashes were always followed by the sound of metal slashing against the armored forearms. Yellow and red sparks seemed to fly when Asuma's trench knives came into contact with Jiro's fingerless gauntlets. Suddenly they were both overcome with a large ring of fire and a storm of poisonous Senbon needles, followed by a large misting of the thick purple stuff. Shuichi was covered in it. Just as suddenly long thin wire made of chakra seemed to cover the grounds. One by one they tripped the others, wrapping both Shuichi and Jiro in the middle of what was left of the clearing. Asuma grinned to himself in cold amusement. Genma was pissed. Not if he did this when they had Jonin assess me. NTS he wouldn't be on the edge of being demoted to Tokubetsu Jonin. Just as suddenly, he watched Genma land down beside him. This was one of the few fights that would be short. Fire release. Dragon's breath technique. The man seemed to fly through the hand seals before a large flame, probably the size of the Konoha's hospital, seemed to fly over the poison, lighting as a flame, making it burn faster and harder. Instead of a normal red-orange, as was a bright sickening green color, almost a bright lime. By the time it settled and the burning had stopped, all that was left happened to be were two crispy corpses. Asuma stared in nothing short of amazement as he looked over the area. It was completely blackened. Kicking lightly, he sighed when all that was left beneath the gray-black ash happened to be the chocolate sea. O Lord of the earth! Don't you think you overdid it a little? Genma snorted, spitting his Senbon out, lodging it several inches into Shuichi's forehead. I think it was justification. We need to send a message to Hokage-sama as soon as possible. Orochimaru already knows about Naruto and Yama-chan, and he was trying to keep us from getting to Tsunade. Apparently he with the cage and the man crushed both his arms and ruined his leg. I take it Shuichi-chan had a mouth, and when did you set up that trap? Asuma asked, before pulling out his supplies to seal the two bodies away. There would be memories inside Jiro's mind if he was put into stasis. He wasn't too sure about Shuichi. There was a Senbon needle 3 inches into his skull. Shuddering at the bodies, Asuma looked at his longtime friend and decided he would never mess with the man's children. Let's go. Genma nodded, before following after Asuma. To be honest, he felt like he was going to vomit at what he'd done. But he didn't feel any regret. The less people outside of the village who knew about his woman and children, the better. The two of them went quiet. That had a hint that Tsunade might be in Manoa. The sooner they found her, the better. Oh, Jiraiya grinned, as he looked over, talked with one of his contacts in the red light district. This was one of the best ways for him to get information. Ninja, especially men, talked after and sake. Most of the women knew he was off limits simply because he wasn't the least bit interested in having with any of them. He might be a perv that spied and gave the occasional grope, but there were only 2 women he'd happily and cheerily. One happened to be his old teammate. and another a woman who'd rocked his world every time he returned to Konoha. Miharu Hasegawa was a thick-hipped, big woman that was always willing to meet him in the confines of her Konoha apartment. The looks Kami gifted her with wasn't anything to laugh at either. Deep, violet bedroom eyes or hair the color of silver, just the thought sent his heart racing. She was a teacher at the academy and an expert in the art of seduction and genjutsu. She also happened to be the top assassin in the Anbu Corps and had been since before little Hitaki had made his name known. As always, she had a saucy grin and laugh ready for the select few that came knocking, and he was to his knowledge the only man that got to be squeezed by the iron grip of her snatch. He liked it that way, and so did she. Cackling slightly at the thought and more than a little bit ready for his next visit home, he could only sigh as a new girl tried to talk her way into his room. He had to admit she was pretty, but then again he was more than ready to return to Miharu and bury his face in the plump mounds that belonged to him. Pushing the dirty thoughts away, he turned the corner to his hotel room. Once he was back where he needed to be, he could only sigh before laying out on the comfortable futon. He'd been drifting off when an overdone poof of smoke rose up around him, and he was pulled from the hotel room by a webbed hand. Sometimes he really hated having a summoning contract, like when they pulled him onto MT Myoboku. Without warning, sometimes they sent Gamakichi, but most of the time it was like this: a quick puff of smoke and a ringing in his ear and he was gone. The toad sage blinked roughly, looking up at the giant toad. He was more than a little baffled. What in the world is going on? Several of the toads were looking at him with worry. They knew, just like Sarutobi knew, that this would more than likely push the toad sage into angry, and while they teased Jiraiya, they did love and care for their summoner. Hajime, come forth. Fukusaku demanded of the young monkey, none too pleased. He had ever intention of speaking with Enma about the young thing's attitude. The small ape walked forward, a disgusted look on his face. This was why he hated dealing with this particular human. He always smelled like, and it grossed him out like nobody's business. Yeah, this is from Gigi. Hajime grunted while holding out the folded envelope toward the large human. Jiraiya sighed, before taking the letter and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Sometimes he hated the fact that he had such a short time to get information. Most of his informants worked into the early hours, and then they had to be sweet-talked or paid before they even started to on the circle of questions that often followed. Usually it meant he slept from noon until midnight, then the process started all over again. It wasn't that he was happy being a night owl, it was actually the opposite. Opening up the letter, he felt his heart drop. Whipping out his own letter, he handed them to Gamashiro, a messenger toad that he worked with on a regular basis. Take this to Miharu and Sensei. The gray-headed toad blinked before nodded, before taking off in a flash. Raya, child, what's going on? Shima asked, a concerned expression on her face. Minato's girl, Naruto. She was attacked at the academy. She's in a coma. Jiraiya had a grim expression on his face. The girl knew him relatively well, and she was about the only female beside his UAL partner and ex-teammate that he bothered to tone down his perversion about. Gamabunta stared at the man before him. He looked as if his heart had been ripped out again, and he wondered briefly how many more times Jiraiya could handle the heartache of being alone. I'll send you back then. I suppose you'll be head back now. Quote. Jiraiya nodded. I just need to gather my things. Apparently Sensei is going to try to get Tsunade back in the village as well, but we all know how that's going to work out. Gamabunta snorted his amusement, before nodding. I'll send you back then. Good lucky, Jiraiya. And with that the white-haired sage was gone, leaving several worried toads. Shima, in all her kindness, could only worry. She knew that there were very few that Jiraiya considered to be important to him at this point in his life. Jiraiya tried not to swallow his tongue. He felt an emptiness in his heart at the thought that his goddaughter was so damaged that she was in a hospital. Normally something like this just didn't happen, but every once in a while it did, and it always made him worry that one day when he came home she wouldn't be waking up and she wouldn't open those big blue eyes of hers. Huffing in annoyance, he gathered his things before apologizing to the matron of the hotel and began the long run back home. He was roughly 8 or 9 hours from Konoha, meaning he would be getting there late at night, and old only hoped that nothing more would happen to the girl while he was away. Sighing in frustration, Jiraiya started off. In a few hours he would call on one of the toads to carry him part of the way, but until then he would get there on his own steam. Oh, Kakashi sighed. He'd been running the whole night, but he was going to have to sleep soon, and he had no problems with that, but he would admit that he was still none too pleased with his Hokage. Though it had pleased him to see that Naruto had so many students from her own grade worried over her, and he thought that most of the youngsters were cute. When he'd gone to say goodbye, he'd been surprised to see the young Hyuga boy, simply sitting with her with a small frown on his face. After asking the boy a question about why he was there, Kakashi was surprised when the boy replied that he was curious about her red chakra pool. Kakashi had nearly had a heart attack at the response, but the rest of the answer was the most amazing. The extra pool of chakra that had once been red had been refilled by Naruto's natural mixture of blue and green, giving it an odd turquoise color. This had set of a chain of events no one had really expected. Naruto now had a secondary pool of chakra that was nearly 3 times as potent as her normal pool of chakra, but neither were getting any larger. It had left several of the medical heads baffled, and it quickly overwhelmed the boy, considering they began to ask more questions than the little Hyuga boy could answer. Kakashi had huffed before sweeping the boy out of the room, and walked him home. He'd learned if there was one thing that could be said about the white-eyed clan of Hyuga was that they happened to be overly polite, and this was no exception. Either way, he'd left the young boy at the edges of his compound, but he'd honestly thought he was near the Uchiha clan with the evil eye that was sent his way when he turned to leave. Thankfully no one had said a thing about the fact that Kakashi was walking the young Hyuga boy home, though he did hear some odd comments about pedophilia. Sometimes he was really grateful he was the last of the White Chakra clan. Raising Naruto here was bad enough, the thought of raising his own offspring sent a cringe down his spine. There was a way to ensure line was passed on, but that was for a later date. God, he really hated camping. More importantly, he hated having to travel so far to complete his mission. This was worse than some of the missions he's been forced to complete in Snow Country several years before. Water Country was not somewhere he wanted to be right now. Not only that, but the particular place he was heading to happened to be a small snowy area. He hated snow too. About the only good thing that had occurred from this ordeal happened to be meeting Naruto's very handsome and cute teacher. He had every intention of getting to know the dolphin when he returned, at least once Naruto woke up. That was something he refused to give up on. Naruto was going to wake up, damn it, he refused to believe that she would spend the rest of her life sleeping. She was too stubborn for that, and he knew some of the things she wanted to do in her life, and he couldn't say that they were bad goals. Everyone needed something to live for. Naru had just found what she needed from life a little sooner than everyone else. Shaking the less than helpful thoughts from his mind, he studied the area in front of him. Hours seemed to have passed and the sun had crossed from early morning to afternoon. It was something he was used to, the long runs and lack of sleep. If he really wanted to have any type of life outside of being a shinobi, then things were going to have to slow down. It was why he'd gotten out of Anbu in the first place. He couldn't tell if the Hokage was alright with his retirement from Black Ops or if he was annoyed at losing one of his best trackers and assassins. Trees seemed to pass by like blurs, as did the hours. This was about the only thing he could say that he appreciated about being a ninja. His mind would always go quiet when he was on a mission. He could stop thinking about everything that had gone wrong in his life and all things or people he'd lost. He could barely think about a time that he was happy. At the edges of his memory he could hear his mother's laughter or the scent of his father when he returned from working with his tracking team. The where found bitter memories. He wouldn't give them up, but that brought a pang to his heart when he thought back about what had happened to his father. Huffing lightly, he looked over the area before him. It was a port town. It was nestled into a small cove on the coast of Konoha. There were several port towns, and it was very rare that a ninja needed to use a port. but sometimes stealth or certain limitations on the ninja's part required the use of a boat, or even the inconspicuousness that could come with pretending to be a civilian. In all honesty, it was about the only way Kakashi was going to be able to get into Mizu no Kuni at this point, the Civil War over. Bloodlines and the assassination attempts on the third Mizukage had made the ninja of Kurigakure paranoid and mean. It had also run off several members of its sword group, and he had no idea how many black ops had been forced from their homes when Yagura gave the word for the execution of those who had once protected him. He was relatively sure nearly 40 ninja of various bloodlines had joined the Leaf Village. Being a ninja was all that they knew how to do. Needless to say, the paperwork wouldn't be settled for a while, but many of them came as families, and once a second generation of a certain clan was started with Konoha, they would have the option of becoming a clan, with a voting seat on council and clan privileges. Kakashi knew that there was more to it than that simplistic outlook, but he also knew that it gave hope to the ninjas in question, like the woman that Genma was with. She and others like her needed that hope to be able to forego, and forget their roots in Mizu no Kuni. Kakashi shuddered at the thought. They didn't have many bloodlines in Konoha. Many of them had been killed out in the war. Both he and Iruka were examples of dwindling family lines. They had once held clan seats, now they would be things of the past. Kakashi sighed. Before stopping outside the port, he really needed to get his mind off of such morbid thoughts. Glancing up at his head, he sighed before pulling off his Hite-ite, his Sharingan swirled to life before he hunted for a ratty eye patch. It was of hospital quality and white with two stretchy loops that would reach around his head once he put it on. Sniffing the air lightly, he backtracked until finding the water source. A small pond that from the looks of it was used for a farm's reserve at one point in time. Settling beside the pond, he pulled out the temporary hair dye. It was a light brown, and would work best with his pale coloring. He didn't need anyone to be able to point out the copy Nin Kakashi. Working the substance through his hair, he could only cringe at the scent. It was disgusting. He hated the smell of chemicals. It made him sick a lot of times after using the stuff. 40 minutes passed before he began to rinse the chemicals. He could only sigh before pulling out his mirror. It sometimes made him wonder about the things that a ninja needed to keep sealed. Once he was positive there wasn't a sign of silver, he huffed before beginning to rub his hair dry. There wasn't any point in him putting hair gel in his hair. It was long, running down to his chin in the front and down his neck. It was kept scruffy mainly because he didn't keep regular haircuts on his list of things to do. Stripping down, he quickly changed into a more civilian-looking outfit. It was similar to a laborer's, a work t-shirt with a ragged hoodie, and worn-out jeans. They were tight, uncomfortably constrictive in comparison with his Jonin gear. Staring at himself in the reflection of the water, he nodded, pulling out his faux identification information out of a simple seal that had been inked into his skin. If he wasn't using chakra, then none of his seals were visible. The fact that he could seal things like his Jonin suit and other ninja paraphernalia away into his arm was something no one ever picked up on. Forcing himself to focus on the task at hand, he easily handed his information to one of the guards of the port before entering. Studying the town, he could see that it was a well-off. The streets were clean, and because the town was small, so there wasn't much room for rift raft to come in and make an saint in the small seaside town. He could only look over the entrances. There were several small fishing vessels, then 2 large commercial boats that would head out to sea toward Mizu. There didn't seem to be any passenger boats, but he could really be surprised. This was a smaller town, and he had picked it for that reason. The trawlers were coming in for the day, and he was relatively sure they would be willing to allow him to get off for free labor. Several of the trawlers would be out for weeks and float in the oceans. Others would dock in certain ports before going out another day. As he scavenged the boats, it didn't take long for him to find one of the bosuns willing to allow him passage for labor. This was just what he needed. He could use the extra funds to get home quicker once Aoi was dead. For the rest of the day he would wander the port, but that night he would have to sleep. Until then he really wanted to find some food. Oh, it was roughly 15 minutes till the bell rang and the children of Konoha Academy raced from their place of learning. Each one had a different place to return to. Some went home, some had things that they needed to learn as a member of a ninja clan. Certain duties had to be looked after. For Yakumo, it was learning genjutsu. For someone like Sasuke, it was learning about his Sharingan and Kaden jutsu. Yakumo sighed. Looking over the room, she'd been one of the first to volunteer to sit with Naruto. Then again, no one had argued the point. She felt it was a little silly to be sitting by her unconscious friend, but Naruto's guardian had been so concerned that he'd asked all of them to sit with her. They had been surprised but agreed. There had only been 4 of them in the hospital room at the time. But the others had agreed. Thought they had all wondered over the fact that once it was brought up to the other at school, everyone had agreed, even Shikamaru being the lazy guy that he was agreed to. Oh, stay with Naruto. Yakumo grinned. It had been an interesting day to say the least. She'd arrived at roughly the same time school started. Needless to say, it hadn't taken the young heiress any time at all to become bored as an 8-year-old could be. So she'd taken out her amusement on several of the Anbu members who'd been watching over Naruto's room. She knew that she shoulder, but she was bored, so what else could she do? Needless to say, once there was a new rotation of Anbu members that stepped onto the field, she'd had a heyday teasing on of them with everything she could think of, from pranks to nurses. The latter had the most interesting effect. Yakumo wasn't positive, but at one point she was positive the newest Anbu member to come on Naru watch had a nosebleed, even if she wasn't quite sure what had caused it. This was the most fun she'd had in ages, though she'd had to remember to do nothing that couldn't be undone. That was one thing that had been drilled into her head since her sealing with Master Jiraiya and Hokage-sama several months before. She was very good at her genjutsu, so much so that she'd managed to make several people think what was happening to them was real. Her father had warned her that as her abilities grew, she would be able to make what happened in her illusions become real. Yakumo pouted as she looked over Naruto's sleeping form. It was odd, she noticed that Naruto seemed to twitch while sleeping, and when she'd asked one of the nurses about it, she'd gotten a strange look from one of the nurses. It hadn't taken long at all for a doctor to return to the room to check several things. The fact that one of the Anbu members, one with the mask of a washier eagle, deemed fit to monitor what the doctor was doing. She thought that was a little odd, considering none of the masked members seemed to know much about the medical things. Yakumo, what are you doing? A young male voice finally asked from the door, a curious look on his face. Oh, Choji. Yakumo smiled softly. This was one of the only good things that had occurred from the attack. She now had several friends. While she was one of the clan heirs like several others in her class, she'd never gotten to interact with them until this year because of always being too sick to attend school. Now she had gotten the chance to get to know them. So what are you doing? The large boy asked, a curious expression on his face. Yakumo blushed lightly. Very few knew about her mischievous streak. Her father knew about it, considering he and her mother were more often than not her target. Well, I was playing a prank. She muttered quietly. Choji laughed softly. So you like pranks? Kiba's always playing pranks on Iruka-sensei, and every other teacher we get. He likes to play them on Hana, too. Choji had taken a liking Yakumo, and the girl returned the affection. Both of them were really too kind to be ninja, but they persevered. They both had dreams that only being a ninja could help them complete. A slow, happy grin spread across her lips. Yeah, I really do like pranks, maybe not like Kiba. Yakumo made an amused expression. I play them on my parents all the time. Papa told me I can't play them on anyone else because they can be a little dangerous. Quote. Choji frowned. Before a light of understanding came across his face, because it's genjutsu, right? Yakumo nodded in agreement. Yeep. Papa said if I work at it a lot and expand my chakra, I can make it all become real. So what brings you here anyway, Choji? Don't you normally hang out with Dreamy? Loud laughter could be heard from the room. Choji knew that she and Tenten had come up with a nickname for Shikamaru, but that wasn't what he was expecting. Normally I do, but he had to help his dad with the deer, so he wasn't at school today. He gets really annoyed when people interrupt them, but I think that's because when people show up it makes the deer harder to handle. So I thought I would spend the rest of the time with you, that and I brought you what we went over today. Iruka-sensei said Kotetsu or Azuma would be here later to take over for us. She nodded, before sighing. Eventually the conversation picked up where it started before. Most of it was about food mainly because Yakumo was curious about the types of things Choji's family ate. Choji was also curious about where Yakumo lived. Most clans lived in a compound. About the only person he knew that didn't was Shikamaru. Thought he was a little curious. He didn't think Shikamaru was really working with Hi's dad. Alright you two, I need you guys to leave. It was a young woman with a small smile on her face. She was one of the nurses that had continually checked up on Naruto. Honestly, it was a bit unnerving. Both students blinked in surprise before actually looking out the window. It was getting dark. They each needed to go home. I'll see you in class, Yakumo. Choji grinned. Who's staying tomorrow anyway? Tenten. Lee demanded to be able to stay on the third day though. Yakumo giggled. She thought the dark-haired boy was cute and funny, but she would never admit that to anyone else. Really? I volunteered Shika for a day. I just have to tell him that. Choji grinned lightly at Yakumo's startled then amused face. It was something he liked about her. Almost all the people who's gotten involved with Naruto, almost all of them were different. He wasn't sure what it was, but they were different. Anyo, I'm sorry to interrupt the two of you, but you really should get home. A voice from the doorway spoke up. A look of amusement could be seen on a clean-spoken face. The young man was of an average height and not in the least bit intimidating. He had relatively short hair with longish bangs that fell across one of his eyes, keeping it from view. He was also had the metal plate of his Hittite inserted into his bandana and was wearing that instead of a regular headband. The two youngsters scurried away laughing in amusement, leaving the room empty besides the young Chunin. He'd been surprised at the request, but it was easily something within his realm, so there was little reason to say no. Settling in the chair that was still warm from the Kurama air, he studied the small girl on the bed. He and his partner Kotetsu were known for always being stuck on guard duty, not that Kotetsu would ever complain. More often than not, they were also called on to try to catch Naruto when she pulled one of her insane pranks. Not that either of them were really efficient for that particular duty. 9 times out of 10 the two of them would die laughing at whatever it was that she'd done. One such a time she dumped a bucket of water-resistant paint on a particular merchant that had taken to overcharging the children of Konoha. Needless to say, the man was an interesting shade of gray for several weeks. It was odd for him. He saw Naruto on a regular basis. She was one of the few people of Konoha that would stop by to talk to Kotetsu and himself. So it wasn't hard to believe that the two young adults had a certain affection for the young girl who made guard duty less boring than it had to be. She was such a vibrant person. To see her so still made him ache. He also knew that he was going to be one of many people that would be on the tower grow. When the Uchiha who had done this was sealed. They had decided to make it public and he had to cringe at the humiliation this would put the Uchiha clan through. Honestly, he hoped that the older, more sensible members of the clan would realize that their member was in the wrong. But the rumbling on the street were already angry that the Hokage was protecting the demon brat again. Shaking his head at the foolishness of the civilian population, Azuma continued to study the room before settling in for the night. For the foreseeable future, both he and Kotetsu would be on night duty to watch over Naruto, and to be perfectly honest, he would much prefer working inside the air-conditioned room of the hospital in comparison to dusty, and sometimes rough merchants that accompanied gate duty. Oh, Asuma groaned once they rolled into the town Manoa. They had been in the large trading town for several hours and it seemed that they were on the right trail. Someone of a similar description with a pet pig had been through and they hadn't been seen or heard of leaving this particular village, no. Only that, but most of the casino owners seemed more than a little happy. This had led both Asuma and Genma to believe that Tsunade was in the village, but both of them were more than worried about getting on her bad side. Neither of them really wanted to look like Master Jiraiya after spying on Th. Hot springs. Do you want to look for her, or do you want to sleep on it? Genma asked, eyeing his partner with a lazy confidence that tended to get the older man in trouble. Both men shared a glance before they both sighed, splitting up. Genma headed toward the casinos while Asuma headed for the bar. Genma almost cried. This was the fourth casino he'd walked into and so far there was nothing. But then again, Manoa was a big town. There were close to 40 casinos in a city of this size. Thought he supposed he'd gotten the short end of the straw. Every single one of the casinos had a bar that he had to go through as well. The biggest issue was being harassed by the owners to sit down and play. Generally when he just smiled and oh so polite stated he was searching for someone, they generally turned away and didn't bother him. Genma. Genma blinked before turning around. It was a feminine voice and that surprised him. Then again, he must be doomed for something horrible when he got home. Looking over the woman, he could only sigh. It was Shizune. She had followed Tsunade when she'd left the village a year before the Kyuubi attack. It's been a while. Shizune. Genma studied her. She really hadn't changed, not much anyway. Her hair was still in that simple short cut that fell around her the tops of her shoulders, while those big black eyes seemed just as innocent and frightened as they had when they had gone on a missio and together after the war. What are you doing here? Shizune had to ask, returning the curious glance. Genma was certainly taller than the last time she'd seen him. In fact, she'd been taller than him, but that had been close to 9, almost 10 years ago now. Genma rolled his eyes. It should be pretty obvious. I'm the idiot that got stuck trying to bring Tsunade-sama back to Konoha. He shuddered. Both he and Asuma had a copy of the letter that the third had sent and neither of them wanted to know what was in it. Not only that, but they had to hand it to the cage-level Kunoichi. Shizune frowned. You know she'll never agree. You don't think I know that? I don't really have a choice in the matter. So please put me out of my misery. Shizune, where can I find her to at least give her this note? Genma related. He knew that the Sanin, all three of them were stubborn. Shizune stared up into light brown eyes. They were weary and held just a smidgen of sadness, as if he would rather be anywhere than in Manoa at this point in his life. Nodding sadly, she turned and simply walked toward the gaming room. This was one of the larger parlors in the city. The room itself was large, holding more games than Genma wanted to count and just as many people who were foolish enough to waste their money. He pointedly ignored the fact that the lady Tsunade was one of many who spent their time addicted to alcohol, and emptying their pockets to people like those who owned casinos. Looking around, Light Eyes found the woman he was searching for. He could only sigh before walking forward. Gold Eyes glared at him as he approached. Damn, he knew this wasn't going to end well. Tsunade-sama. Jonin, what do you want? Tsunade asked, coldly glaring over the man. He didn't seem to be any happier about this meeting than she was. I was ordered by the Hokage to give you this letter. As such, I would appreciate it if you don't kill me. I have very little to do with what is actually in that little letter. Genma replied, his humor as dry as his current mood. Tsunade looked over the younger man before barking in laughter. The boy had guts, or he was so tired he wasn't thinking straight. Taking the letter from the Jonin, she ripped the top away, before pulling the letter out. Before unfolding the letter, she was asked to place a bet. Looking at the odds, she agreed, going all in. Just as the letter was completely unfolded, she blinked, before her attention was pulled back toward her bet. Something akin to a scowl covered her face when it listed that she'd won, considering she'd bet roughly 838,899.93 ryo. Because of the odds, it multiplied by 100, but it was more than enough to cover most of her expenses and even pay back most of her debt. Snarling at the letter, her eyes went wide when she read what was written. That bastard. Shizune blinked in surprise. What's in the letter, Tsunade-sama? Did you know about this? Tsunade snarled, looking at the young Jonin. I asked not to be killed for a reason. Genma retorted, but yes, we were informed of what was in the letter. I wasn't too hot for this mission, no one was. His eyes were cold. Very few in Konoha would admit it, but Tsunade-sama wasn't the only one who'd lost loved ones, but she was the only one. T was allowed to act in such a disgraceful way. Many of the ninja in the corps looked at her with a certain type of disdain, and some contempt. They would all admit that she was an amazing kunoichi, but that couldn't take pride that she was from Konoha. At least Jiraiya-sama returned and helped the village by being a spy. Tsunade scowled. She really had no choice but to return. If Sarutobi had completely frozen her assets, then no one in Fire Nation or any other nation would accept her credit. Fine. I'll come back. Shizune. Take my winnings and pay off as many creditors as possible. I'm assuming more than one of you came on this mission. Her golden eyes seemed to glare, as if demanding that he magically produce his partner. Genma nodded. Will leaving in the morning suit you? I'll be returning with you. Asuma will be going with the Shizune. Shizune ept. Asuma Sarutobi. She looked slightly unsettled and more than a little panicked at the thought. In fact, a large blush seemed to pass over her cheeks. Genma studied the smaller woman with a slightly amused smile. Tsunade tried not to roll her eyes. Shizune had a crush on the Sarutobi boy when they had left the village nearly 9 years before. Tsunade finally nodded. Before taking the winnings and leaving, turning back briefly, she seemed to stare into his soul. I expect to see you at the south gate in the morning. With that, she resumed her trek toward the door. Genma huffed in frustration. Before leaving, he would meet Asuma when he returned to their room. That was something that they had done before going on the wild goose chase that so far was turning out to be not so wild. This wouldn't be so bad. It really depended on how fast Tsunade was going to want to get back to Konoha to bitch at the Hokage. Oh, Miharu Hasagawa sighed. As she wandered into her apartment, she was more than dead tired. She'd been drafted for an B rank turned S rank seduction and assassination mission. Needless to say, her target was dead, and she'd taken a great pleasure in making sure the man in question would never put his hands on a child again. It was roughly 10 at night and she wanted nothing more than a long hot bath. Biting her thumb roughly, she pressed the bloody digit against her door frame before releasing a small amount of chakra into the seal. Her door swung open with practiced ease. This was possibly the best thing that her lover had ever taught her. Having enough information to be able to keep her place safe meant more to her than he could know. But then again, it was very likely Jiraiya had done it to be certain that nothing could get to her behind these walls. She made things for certain members of the Shinobi Council more difficult than they had once been. She was the spy within Anbu. She kept things in order. She was silent and deadly sand. She always recognized those they weren't really one of Sarutobi Nin's. Walking forward, she pulled the steel hair pins from her short shoulder-length hair. Really, there was no need for hairpins off. Other than the things kept her bangs from her face. The particular pair she was wearing happened to be from Jiraiya. No one of the village knew this, and she liked it that way. It kept things simple. Laying the hair pieces on her kitchen counter, she blinked, studying the note on the table. The only thing that could get into her apartment besides herself and Jiraiya happened to be a summons, and not even they could summon another person into her apartment. Nothing could override the blood seal keeping those who weren't keyed into her apartment out. Lifting the letter to her face, she could honestly say that she was surprised. It wasn't uncommon for Jiraiya to send a toad ahead to tell her that he was coming. The odd thing was that he was coming home so soon. Not that she really minded, but she did have to wonder what could have occurred while he was away. Jiraiya usually came in spring and fall, generally staying in Konoha for a month before taking off for another 5 or 6 months. It was just something she and anyone in Konoha was accustomed to. She could only shrug her shoulders before removing her kunai pouch and medical supplies. Walking toward the back of the apartment, she could only grin as she began to strip down to nothing. Shivering at the cool air, she could only sigh as steam began to rise in the large bathtub that happened to be her favorite purchase. Slipping into it, Miharu huffed. It wasn't quite as good as going to a hot spring, but it was damn close. Dunking down into the water once she'd resurfaced, long slender fingers wrapped around a bottle, before the small popping sound of the shampoo could be heard as it slipped into her hands. Miharu could only sigh in relief as she began to massage the soapy goodness into her hair. That was the worst part about being in assassination. If they started fighting back, they tended to get blood everywhere. Normally, she killed via poison, it was her favorite way to get rid of AV. Ictum. She really did hate getting blood in her hair, it always tended to get sticky and gross afterwards. She soaked for nearly an hour and continued to repeated scrub her hair and skin. The man she'd been sent to kill had disgusted her. But what worried her was the fact that he'd seemed to know that was coming. It was one of the reasons she'd come back home with another wound that would eventually turn into a scar. She was relatively certain that Danzo was now aware that she kept tabs on all his silly little root members, needless to say, even if she died, only Jiraiya could get to the goods, so to speak, so either way the old fart was doomed. Shaking the thoughts from her mind, she settled in her room, finding one of Jiraiya's civilian shirts. She could only grin when she got a good whiff of his scent still lingering on the cloth. Hing. Pulling the shirt over her head, she crawled into bed. She was more than a little tired. Nearly 2 hours passed before Jiraiya let himself into her apartment without a bit of sound being made. He had things he needed to do, but they could wait until the morning. Damn it, he was too old to be staying up for more than a day at a time. Grumbling to himself, he stripped down to nothing before crawling into the Western-style bed beside Miharu. She was out like a light. Not even being in an unconscious state stopped her from rolling over and curling into his body. The light movement awakened her. It was something that all ninja eventually learned with time. Small movements like that and awareness could mean the difference between life and death. Raya. Sleepy violet eyes were blurry with fatigue and couldn't seem to focus on his face. Her thick silver high R seemed to gleam in the low light as it splayed out behind her back and shoulders. Jiraiya simply looked down at the woman snug against his side. She looked more worn out than normal and he had to wonder at it. Yeah, it's Miharu. He could only chuckle when she gave a content little sigh before burying her face further into his neck. He could tell by the little noise in the back of her throat that she had more questions, but for now it was time for sleep. Sleep, Miharu. We'll talk about it in the morning. There were no questions in his voice, just a gentle command, though he was positive she was dozing off before it even left his lips. It didn't take him long to follow her into a dreamless sleep. Tomorrow morning he had a sensei to grill and a little girl to look in after. Woot conversion, for anyone wondering. 10 yen is 1 ryo. 10 yen in the American dollar is roughly 0.12 cents. Anyone want to try to take a guess at the amount? Genma huffed in frustration as he ran. Tsunade had been in a bitching mood since they had met at the gates that morning, and he wanted nothing more than to suffocate her. Or for her to knock herself out with her own tits. Sometimes he wondered about Tsunade. He had always been curious about the Sannin, how they had managed to become so emotionally weak in comparison to the rest of Konoha. He could say he didn't understand the consequences of being a ninja. It had cost him heavily in his lifetime. Rumors and questions always floated around the Great Three. Once upon a time Tsunade and Orochimaru were considered to be the strongest members of the trio. Now it seemed that Jiraiya-sama had risen up from the depths and become one of the best. He had once been the irresponsible flirt, now he seemed to be a relatively responsible ninja that loved a little girl along with the one and only Kakashi. Would you please shut up? Genma finally spoke up. I can't even hear myself think over her bitching. He thought silently, before a sigh escaped his lips at the volatile look sent his way. He understood that she didn't want to return to Konoha because she blamed the place for taking everything from her, but damn, bitching about it didn't help anyone. He wanted to be back home with his girlfriend and snuggle up against her warm small body, but no, he got stuck with the bitchy old woman. Tsunade nearly snarled at the younger man before she actually looked closely at the man. He was obviously exhausted and wasn't all too keen to be on this particular mission. And that was something she had to wonder about. What had changed so much that Konoha wouldn't want a Senju in the village? What's changed about Konoha? She finally asked after much deliberation. She almost wanted to ask why he and her sensei's son had been less than pleased to find her. Genma studied her. For once she'd stopped complaining and he had to wonder why she would care. It had nothing to do with her. Even if Tsunade stayed in the village, there was a number of people that wanted nothing to do with the woman. We've learned not to rely on heroes. The tone was sullen as if he was remembering a particularly bad dream. We've learned that the only way to protect Konoha, to protect what we love, is to fight for it ourselves. Not even Minato could protect what was most important to himself. The statement was cryptic, but anyone in the village with a brain would have been able to make the connection. He forcibly cut himself off. He could feel anger course through him. Frustration seemed to well up inside his heart. He had to wonder how many people might have lived if Tsunade and her talents had been in the village. There were just so many thoughts and worries inside his mind. How many people would have been living? It was a question that could never be answered. It was something many nins of Konoha tried not to think about. Their medical techniques had never been amazing. Once upon a time Tsunade had begun teaching them and the medic corps flourished. One by one her students died after Tsunade ran from Konoha with all the pain rising up in her heart, and Konoha was left with morons who were nowhere near as talented as they should have been. No one in good conscience would blame the hot-headed Senju princess for leaving, but many wondered what life would have been like if the older Kunoichi had returned. The older woman couldn't help but to notice the dip in voice, the inflection, as if thinking about the aftereffects of the war followed by the Kyuubi had killed some part of him. He was so young. Almost all nins were young, they rarely managed to make it past 40, and those that did generally retired. Studying the boy, Tsunade could only frown. Something besides what was happening in Konoha was eating at him, and she had to wonder at it. She could easily tell that he was too young to have gone to war and come back completely unaffected. What else is eating you, kid? Nothing I'm willing to talk about outside the village. Genma scoffed at himself. It had been stupid of himself and Asuma to talk about such things outside of the village. Both of them knew it. He would never ever put his family in such danger again. Not only that, but he had to think over the fact that both of those two nins of unknown origin had known information that none should know. In fact, we have a mole inside the village. Asuma and I were only given this assignment a short time ago. The older blonde frowned. That could spell disaster for Konoha. It could mean the destruction of Konoha, something her grandfather had worked so hard for. Something her uncle and teacher had continued. It made her heart ache thinking of them. She loved them and cursed them all the same. Closing her eyes, she left the silence fall cold between her current traveling companion. Before they both began to speed up, each of them needed the time to think to themselves about the difficulties that were fast beginning to approach. Oh, it's been a while, sensei. Jiraiya smirked, slightly at seeing his teacher as well as the four clan heads helping him jump in utter surprise at his voice. He could easily see that they had worked through a lot of information, and it made him wonder exactly what had happened to put the lot of them into such a tizzy. He knew from walking among the civilians that they were upset about some ruling involving his goddaughter and the Kurama heir. The fact that they thought the boy didn't deserve any punishment for what had happened showed that the civilians had utterly lost their minds. Jiraiya, why can't you ever use a door? Sarutobi asked, before moving from his stooped position to sit in one of the chairs that surrounded the table that was loaded down with books. He'd known his student had arrived that morning at around 2 a.m. because of the guards and ward signature that recorded everyone who entered Konoha. He'd also been thankful when the younger man had gone somewhere to sleep instead of waking him from a relatively peaceful sleep. That would make things far too easy. Now what exactly has happened? Jiraiya wasn't usually forceful and was in fact damn good at being as subtle as needed. It was why he was such a good spy in comparison to others. He had also trained a number of men and women to take his place should that me ever come that he needed to retire. I suppose you didn't read the whole letter. Hiruzen sighed, looking over the younger man. Jiraiya in a way was exactly like the 6-year-old that looked up at him, used to being ignored and used to having to try his hardest to get the smallest amount of attention. At the same time, the man before him had grown so much in the same way. Jiraiya no longer tried to get the approval that would come from his sensei or even the people of Konoha. Instead, the man did what he felt was right and often proved he had a bigger moral code than many knew. Oh no, I read it but I want the details, old man. Jiraiya rarely felt angry, but for once it was riding up inside him with a type of rage he'd never felt before. The white-haired man had been angry at Orochimaru for turning on them. He'd been angry when Minato had been killed, and the middle-aged Nen had been furious when he'd been denied the right to take his goddaughter and Kakashi away from the village. The Hokage could only sigh. Well, it all started about a month before this incident happened. The older man replied, before going on to talk about the unfair grading. The fact that he'd had the young girl retested before having the academy gone over with a fine-tooth comb. How Naruto had moved in with Kakashi and actually started making friends, before running into the Uchiha boy who'd tried to hurt the girls because he felt that he was above the laws. By the time the Hokage was done explaining things, Jiraiya was literally putting of enough chakra to knock the building down. Good God, old man, what had you been doing while I was away? Jiraiya knew he shouldn't blame his former teacher, but wasn't his job to be on top of things. The white-haired ninja simply sat before rubbing his hands over his face. He was so tired and exhausted, he wanted nothing more than to sit down and relax. Yes, well, battling with Danzo and the clan heads have been eating up my time. I'm tired of playing games, Jiraiya. I've had enough of this. There was another reason I called you back. Sarutobi had a bit of a twinkle in his eye that made all sane ninja nervous. The elderly man was plotting, and that was never good for whoever it was directed at. When Jiraiya simply raised an eyebrow, Hiruzen continued, I want you to take the Hokage's hat. Jiraiya simply had to pause before turning a disbelieving look at the old man. He was mildly amused and appealed. Something in him cringed at the idea of taking that hat, knowing that it had been Minato's dream and it had killed him. Orochimaru had wanted that hat and it had driven him insane. What did he know of power of politics? Certainly he'd been forced to report to the capital several times during his life as a ninja, but that didn't mean he'd be the best choice. Have you lost your mind, old man? I think that you are the best person for the job, Jiraiya, as much as you play at being a pervert and slacking off. I more than anyone know that you work hard and are quite involved in a steady relationship. Hiruzen could see that this didn't sit well with his former student, and he could understand the distaste for the job. When his own sensei had passed the torch to him, it had been in the middle of war, and it had ultimately killed a part of Sarutobi that he hadn't known he still had. I'll think about it, old man. I'll need to talk to my partners first. Jiraiya stopped there. He would need to talk to the spies he had trained, he would need to talk to Miharu, and he would have to talk to both Tsunade and Kakashi, as the three of them were all involved with one little girl. When his teacher simply nodded his head toward him, Jiraiya could only huff before disappearing out into Konoha. He needed time to think and was positive that the tower would just because for distraction. Oh, Tenten sighed. 2 days ago Naruto had been put in the hospital and Konoha as a whole was rife with rumors. Some were that Naruto had done this on purpose, but those were being shot down by a majority of the Senior Nin, specifically Clan Ninja, and others who had apparently watched over her friend since she was a child. This of course caused the young female to have a whole host of questions. Why had Naruto, who had been forced to live at a ratty orphanage in Eastside, need to have Anbu guards? For another matter, why did Naruto know Hatake Kakashi or the Sarutobi clan so well? Simply in case of demographics, she shouldn't have run into either one of them. Though there had been a slight relief today while sitting with Naruto, most of the doctors and nurses that were working there didn't think anything about talking around the children. Which was actually a very bad thing, considering the fact that if she was an enemy, Tenten would have more information on most of the hospital that she should have. They talked about injured nins that were in the hospital, high-ranking officials, and all sorts of things that made the young girls in C.Day squirm. Allowing civilians to take over the hospital had been an awful idea, and the young weapon mistress was surprised someone hadn't been assassinated already because all the gossip. Though with all the gossip that was flying around, Tenten was able to listen in on what one of the doctors were saying about Naruto, and it pissed the young girl off like nothing else. They wanted to do all sorts of tests on Naruto because they didn't understand how her chakra could be so condensed. They didn't have permission from the Hokage, but they didn't much seem to care. They also talked about how Naruto was a monster and they didn't understand why the Hokage and so many of the Medi Nins were trying to protect the girl. In fact, sometime last night something had occurred and all civilian doctors had been ordered not to come into the room at all. Naruto had been taken out of their care and was now in the Medi Nin's ward. The room was still rather large, but it was cozier. By the time lunch rolled around, Tenten's eyes were wide with the amount of information she'd gotten from careless adults. The things that went on in this hospital couldn't be exactly legal in some cases, and she knew that when she got home that afternoon she was going to have a long talk with her dad. Was it even safe for Naruto to be in a place like this? Ah, Tenten. As her name was spoken, the bun-haired girl looked up to find one of Naruto's classmates looking at her with a curious glance. He also had two different stacks of school work. One was for her and the other was more than likely for Naruto. Tenten could say she felt sorry for her younger friend. Naruto was going to have to play catch-up again after having to do the same the weeks that school was cancelled. Shino, right? Thanks for bringing my school work. Naruto's is over in this stack. The brown-eyed girl informed the young Aburame boy. Because Naruto had been moved, they had to arrange everything in her room. But in a way this was a good thing. There was no telling how long it could take for Naruto to get better, though from the way the blonde acted she was going to hate being coped up in this hellhole, as she would likely call it. Hi, it's nice to see you again. The younger boy bowed lightly before moving to sit across from the older girl. He didn't know much about Naruto, but she had seemed like a nice girl and she'd managed to get Yakumo to open up, which was something most of the clan heirs hadn't been able to do. Though the few times he'd heard the blonde girl speak, the Aburame boy had been blown away at her language and her disregard for social norms. When he'd asked his father about her, Shibi had simply shook his head before telling his son that he needed to get to know the girl himself and form his own opinion. Shino would be the first to admit that he was rather antisocial, and that he had a hard time expressing himself. Though the Aburame boy was eternally grateful that some people didn't mind his oddness, like Hinata or Kiba, neither of them had a problem with his insects. But for a similar reason he disliked Ino and Sakura, because they always made him feel bad when they spoke about his insects and clan. The young boy knew that they didn't really mean any harm with what they said, but it hurt nonetheless to be talked about in such a manner. Tenten smiled. So what did you go over in class today? You know, I never thought that I would miss classes, but the longer I was here the more I wanted to be in class. It had been painful to watch Naruto all day, but it was looking better. The little blonde wasn't so pale and seemed to be getting a bit of color into her cheeks. Nothing much. We had a genjutsu lecture as well as a very long history lecture. I like Yumino-sensei, but he gets very dull with history. You can tell he don't like teaching it, though he is very thorough and makes it easy for us to learn. He much prefers speaking about fuinjutsu or ninjutsu. He's one of the few demolition specialists that work in Konoha. Shino liked Yumino-sensei. The man was kind and relatively informal and always insisted on being called Aruka. Oh, we've had him as a lecturer in the upper-level classes before. It's almost always about fuinjutsu. They said he could be a master if someone was available to teach him. But the Yondaime died, and Jiraiya of the Sannin is never here long enough to teach him. Actually, he supplies a lot of the seals and tags that we have at Da's shop. Tenten had never really met the man but knew that her father liked him well enough. I'm not surprised. Yumino-sensei is more like a scholar than a fighter. I'm not sure how he came to be a ninja. Shino replied easily. It was refreshing to have a simple conversation with another person. Generally, he spoke with Hinata, Kiba, Shikamaru, Choji or Sasuke. None of them liked to speculate or have long discussions about anything, and Choji and Sasuke were still very awkward around him, as if they weren't entirely sure what to make of him. Tenten grinned. She had to agree with him on that, and the young teacher was just a tad on the effeminate side. Oh, I have a question for you, and this isn't meant to be offensive or intrude on your clan policies or anything. But can you really talk to bugs? It was something she had wondered about often. The Aburame clan rarely came into her da's shop other than to replace kunai, and on occasion seals. The group of them were disturbingly self-sufficient, at least according to her father. Shino blinked in surprise before a smile that was hidden by his high collar appeared on his lips. Yes. But it's closer to telepathy than speaking to them. Insects don't have a structured language like people do. It's closer to a movie. They don't have words or opinions. So every time you ask them a question, you get a picture response. Tenten had to admit that she was terribly curious about it. It sounded so interesting, and when Shino nodded at her question, more ideas and questions began to pop into her mind. The young girl couldn't help but to ask, can you speak with other things in that way, like humans or other animals? I don't honestly know. I've never heard of anyone in the clan trying anything like that. Though I have heard rumors that we've been trying to cultivate a different species, I can't really say more or my family will get mad at me. That was one thing that all clans had, a rule of not speaking to in depth about the abilities of the clan. The first offense could get you kicked out of the clan, and there was no higher form of shame than being removed from the clan register. Tenten could only nod. I was just wondering, but thanks for answering my questions. I'll try not to pry. It gave both of them something to wonder on. Tenten found the idea of speaking to someone else inside their head to be fantastic, but it was a lot like the Yamanaka clan. Yet at the same time, it was nothing like the Yamanaka clan. The Yamanaka clan had a lot of drawbacks that came with their ability to throw themselves into someone else's body. One of the biggest was if they didn't get out before an enemy was killed, then they were killed too. Shino nodded. It's alright. A quiet, relaxed air seemed to settle over the two of them, but it didn't stop the two of them from speaking about other things like Konoha and who their favorite ninja happened to be. Shino would say his favorite happened to be someone from his clan, the man who had been the first to discover the Kikaichu and create the bond that was what made the Aburame clan what it was. Tenten, on the other hand, was extremely fond of the Lady Tsunade, and Shino couldn't fault her for it. There was a sad lack of well-trained kunoichi in Konoha. It was uncommon for different grades to mix, so it hadn't been surprising when they realized they didn't know much about the other. Tenten had been surprised. She discovered how many clan heirs were in the same class and could only ask about the security nightmares it must cause for Anbu, which caused the young Aburame boy to snicker in agreement, and over the next several hours the two enjoyed getting to know one another and developed a healthy respect for the other. Oh, Asuma sighed. This would be the 8th house they had gone to in the Land of Fire, and the youngest Sarutobi boy was actually truly amazed at the amount of money that Tsunade had been able to spend, and that was saying something. The payout and put a nice dent in her creditors, but Shizune wasn't out of money yet, and had informed him that her mentor had debts in Cloud and Wind Country. But most of them were in here in Fire Country, and that if she got to pay most of them off, Shizune would be ever grateful. But that was something that did concern the Sarutobi man. Shizune seemed to be going above and beyond to help Tsunade, and while he understood the need to pay the woman back, Shizune didn't seem to be living a life on her own, and that was never healthy. Light brown eyes studied the woman in front of him. She was just as cute as she had been when they had gone to the academy. Those dark eyes seemed to have a relatively happy shine to them, while her hair was in the same style it had always been, longer sides cut at an upward angle to a short back with shorter choppy bangs. She was still petite, thin, and in a lot of ways not so different. She'd grown into her figure, wasn't as clumsy as she once was. Anyo, Sarutobi-san. Shizune was looking up at her male companion with concern. Asuma had been a quiet for most of the run, but she could tell he was SLIGHTLY horrified that all the money Tsunade had managed to make was going into paying off investors. The young medic couldn't help but agree with the expression, because this was probably 6 or 7 times the budget of Fire Country. Call me Asuma, please. Sarutobi is my dad. The young Junin reminded. and had a hard time hiding the smile that ran across his face at the blush that settled on hers. There was another thing that surprised him. Shizune hadn't outgrown the formalities that she'd grown up with. Most of the nins of Konoha got over that relatively quickly unless they were in polite society with the lords or daimyo. There was just little point when most of their clients were common people that generally looked at them with disdain. Alright, but I was wondering why you simply didn't go back with Tsunade and Genma. Shizune had to admit to being curious. He hadn't be required to go back, though Genma had seemed positive that Asuma would stay with her throughout the whole thing. If anything happened to you, Tsunade would blame the two of us, then Konoha. Neither of us really thought it was a good idea to take the chance. We both know you can take care of yourself. It's always wise to have backup, and that's really what I am at the moment, though I do feel for Genma when he gets back home. Asuma replied easily. The last thing he needed was a female that was willing to take his head off. He could see that she was accepting of the answer, if not entirely pleased with it. Shizune had to sigh. They were right. If anything did happen to her, Tsunade would blame them and become extremely angry and would probably take it out on the two of them if for no other reason than she could. Her mentor no longer had respect for anyone except perhaps her teammates or her former teacher. Because of this, the older woman didn't care who she hurt, and Shizune was oftentimes forced to clean up after her. This is the next place, right? Asuma looked up at the place in question. It was rather shoddy, and it concerned him that Tsunade would be taking money from people like these. Shizune simply sighed before nodding. This was the one that she was dreading. The others had been delighted to get their money back with all that interest that had to be paid back. This one, on the other hand, wouldn't mind just getting his hands on Tsunade as a toy. The man was a coward and just about worthless as far as being a king-happy human could be. She hated it when her mentor went to men like this. It wasn't as if Shizune could retaliate. The man was still a civilian even if he was slime. Hello, I was wondering if Miho was in. Shizune started. If she could get away with it, she would talk to the man's daughter. The daughter was just as bad as the father, but she wouldn't try to group the young nin. The young man looked up before shaking his head. You'll have to talk to Kirihara. Miho took off about 6 months ago and ain't about to come back. Sorry, lady. The back door is open, so go on in. The young man looked to be in his late teens and wanted nothing more than to run out the door, but he was holding his own. He wasn't about to quit. He needed the money working here provided. Once he had enough, he planned on making a run for it to get heck out of this hell hole, just like Miho. Shizune cursed silently, and in that instance was very grateful that Asuma had come along with her. The male beside her was big and brawny, and Asuma wasn't afraid to take his anger out on a civilian that was acting out of line. Shivering to herself, Shizune did the only thing she could think of at the moment, dragging Asuma to the side and asked for help. I need your help for this one. Asuma raised an eyebrow at the smaller ninja. What do you want me to do? This could end badly or it could go extremely well. Thought he had to wonder as to why she was suddenly so happy that he was around, not that he minded. Kirihara is the lowest of the low, and possibly the worst type of scum I've met in a long time. He's also a pervert, not like Jiraiya-sama. I think he's hateful toward women. I was hoping you could be intimidating. I really don't want him to touch me. Shizune wasn't usually this candid with what she was thinking, but Asuma wouldn't mind. Asuma sighed as he looked at the smaller woman. Before simply nodding, he could play big bad relatively well. Most people, men and women, were intimidated by his size anyway. Being tall and broad hadn't done him any favors. Instead, he simply rubbed the back of his head before agreeing. The Sarutobi man just hoped this didn't get him into more trouble with his dad. They were slowly beginning to mend the relationship that had been torn apart when he joined the Fire Guardians in the capital. Shizune smiled, very grateful that he was willing to help her in this endeavor. She was going to have to warn him that this would be happening quite often until they were finished. The more Tsunade, the harder it had been to find someone to fund her gambling, and if it was left up to Shizune, her meant or would never be allowed within 5 miles of a gambling hall again. When the two returned to the inside of the loan shark's office, the boy that had been there gave the two of them a mildly amused look before nodding to the hallway on his left. Both nins shared a look. Before heading down the hallway, eventually they came to an office where quite a lot of shouting went on before the door swung open and a woman stormed out cursing. Looking in, Asuma found himself weary of the man inside the office room. His hair was a white blonde that showed he had very odd genetics, and his skin was a dark tone for someone who spent a large amount in the sun. His eyes were a deep gray color that seemed to bore into a person's body, and from the way Shizune was stiffening up, he was beginning to wonder if this was Kirihara at all. Tsunade's little apprentice. I never thought I would see you again. Did that old hag finally kick the bucket? The man asked, those dark eyes lighten with sick amusement at the thought of death. This business did a lot of things: sold women, sold men, assassinations, loaned money. It was a very lucrative business without the morals that was needed to run a ninja village. Tsunade-sama is fine. She finally managed to win back enough money to pay off some of her debts. Shizune replied, her tone cold while her eyes seemed to be looking over the place as if looking for a trap. Oh really? Am I the first to get my money back? Kirihara looked intrigued at the idea that Tsunade could actually hit the one-time lucky moment. No, this is actually the 8th lender I've seen today, Shizune replied in a very dismissive way, as if it wasn't that much of a big deal, but in reality it was a very very big deal. Kirihara snorted in amusement. Then let's see, a 500,000 ryo loan, at 34% interest per month. You've only had the loan for 4 months. Well, that's roughly 1,203,052 ryo. What he didn't expect was a rolled scroll to be thrown onto his desk that created a definite heavy thump. Raising a brow, the older man channeled a small amount of chakra into the sealed item and was pleased as could be when the contents were ejected. It was a small amount of ryo that would need to be counted. Where can I get into contact with you to end our dealings? Quote, a messaging bird will work fine. Shizune replied primly before standing to leave. What she didn't expect was Asuma's quick movement. The bigger man had a hold on both the slender man's wrists in one hand, while the other was wrapped around the man's throat, not tightly enough to suffocate him, but enough to allow the smaller man to know that he meant business. Now, why would you do that? I recognize that face. As a mission nin, you probably don't want me to say anything but hand Shizune the receipt and allow us to be on our way, or I'll simply take your head into the next Merc station we come across. Asuma hissed. He'd seen the man go for the Senbon needle he kept hidden in his pocket. Unfortunately for the man, Asuma could see hidden weapons from a mile away. Because of that, it was easy for the Sarutobi make to identify what the other man was going for. Very well, Kirihara muttered, trying to get loose. It had been a long time since he'd been caught in such a hold or been forced up against his own walls because of carelessness. The man in front of him wouldn't regret killing him in the least and would simply walk out with the money to pay someone else who wouldn't think about double-crossing him. Once the big fellow dropped him, Kirihara couldn't help but to grumble. Those eerily light brown eyes were watching his every move as if waiting to attack. He was going to have to move his business. He'd been working in the same town for 6 years, and one young hotshot Konoha bastard was going to make him move. When Shizune got the receipt and they were leaving, Asuma simply watched with weary eyes until they were both out of the building. Shizune, on the other hand, was practically hoping with delight. She'd never seen the older man lose his cool in that way, and it delighted her. Shizune couldn't help but that the taller man repeatedly, which simply got an amused grin in return. This was going to be so much easy with someone like Asuma around. Oh, Jiraiya sighed. He'd spent time wandering around Konoha trying to wrap his head around the fact that he, the Dobi of his team, was being asked to be the Hokage. He had expected Tsunade to be the next in line. Then again, at least he was sober most of the time in comparison, and he wouldn't run the risk of gambling away Konoha's cash flow. Returning to the apartment, Jiraiya found himself sitting on the couch wondering what the devil he was going to do. The white-haired ninja didn't want to put up with the head clan council, or the civilian council, or the 3 advisors to the Hokage. Then again, Konoha by itself needed to be restructured anyway. The defense it might had was slowly corroding away because the land was being clear-cut far too close to the city's defenses. Raya, what are you doing? You look silly just sitting there. A warm, sultry feminine voice spoke softly in his ear while slender, shapely fingers danced down his chest. He could feel a soft female form pressed against his shoulders as well. He could also feel silky hair rubbing against his cheek. It was a nice warm feeling for him to be home with someone that did care. Sarutobi asked me to do something that I never thought he would. Jiraiya replied easily, laying his head back across her shoulder. The older man really just didn't know how to respond. He'd wanted so badly to be the Hokage when he was younger, but he'd then that dream up when he'd heard Orochimaru speaking about it to their teacher. He'd never brought the subject up again. In a way, it was cruel for his former sensei to do this to him, to throw this into his face again after so much time. It would mean a lot of reformation in himself, but it would also require a lot of reformation of Konoha itself. As much as the Toad Nin loved his home, it needed a massive overhauling. The academy system was out of date, the economy was down. Slums had started springing up across the board, and the Uchiha Police Corps weren't doing their jobs considering the higher rate of crime that was pretty much across the border. It would be a lot of work, and he didn't know if he wanted to sink that much more of his life into such a place. The female pressed against the back of the couch, and her lover could only blink in surprise. Oh really? And what did he ask? He wants me to be the Hokage. Jiraiya answered, but he could only think of the responses and regrets of childhood. The white-haired man had been the kindest out of them, the one who was willing to help the less fortunate. Tsunade was too involved in her family, while Orochimaru, well, the older man had always been all about himself. Miharu quieted for a moment before she spoke honestly. I think you should do it. The spy network that you have is more than extensive, and you have enough members to replace you. There are close to 30 of us all across the elemental nations to get you the information that you need, but Konoha needs someone with a firmer hand. Which is something it has only had for brief moments in time. During the war, Sarutobi was strong and unshakable. When the old man was ready to pass it on to Minato, we ended up getting a sweetheart that was happy to play the hard to get the results that he wanted. But when Sarutobi went back into office, he let things slide, has been letting them slide. The civilian council was never supposed to sit in on meetings of the head, and the daimyo is less than pleased with some of the reports coming out of Anbu. Quote, really Miharu, a firmer hand in me? Jiraiya could only snort at the idea. It had been a long time since he'd trained genin, but this is what control of Konoha was starting to sound like. The violet eyes woman sighed, before moving to straddle the man's lap. Taking his cheeks in hand, she forced the older man to look at her. Konoha is dying. It is dying because of negligence and greed. Danzo has caused more problems for us in the last 6 years than any other. If he is not stopped, Konoha will be understaffed, undertrained, and without hope because a war is stirring, and we both know this. Homura is about the only person left on the council staff that actually gives a damn. Kaharu and Danzo, they aren't doing things because it benefits Konoha, they are doing as they will because they can. I know you very well, Jiraiya. I have known you since I was a child, irritating the great Jiraiya to teach a little annoying academy student jutsu when you were just a genin. Do you realize how long that is to know someone inside and out? 30 years, and in that time I became a friend and lover. I know you can do this, but we need Uri. One thing the assassin was sure of, they needed someone who would tell everyone to shut up and sit down because they were going to do things one way and one way only. So many ideas would fly about during these meetings that nothing would be decided and another meeting would be called a few days later. In all honesty, they should only be having meetings once a week at most, and bi-weekly was preferred. Jiraiya could only stare at the woman before him in shock. It felt good to know that someone believed in him from intimate knowledge. It was also a relief that she believed he could do this on his own merit instead of being a substitute for someone else. There was a deeply scholarly person buried under a rough and tumble exterior. many people forgot exactly how hard fuinjutsu, how much knowledge one had to acquire to be able to use that type of skill. As much as a pervert as Jiraiya was, he had basically raised Minato by himself, and the boy had been a beautiful achievement until his death. Now, can we stop being serious? I have something else I'd much rather be doing. Miharu purred out. Her violet eyes seemed to have gotten darker with lust, and it always made his gut jump in excitement. Jiraiya could only snort when a hot open mouth descended on his neck to leave light bite marks in its wake, while amorous hands seemed to be wandering under every opening in his clothing. Holding the underside of the woman's thighs, a husky groan could be heard from both of them when the white-haired Nin moved the two of them to the bedroom. He was too old to be rolling around on the floor or couch, and there was a perfect large available bed in the next room. There was absolutely no reason for him not to make use of it. Strong hands shifted grips so he could push open the door, and once the bedroom was shut and the sound seals activated, it wouldn't be until morning before either one of the Nins emerged. Oh, Uruka sighed softly as he signed out of work. Ever since Naruto had been admitted to the hospital, he'd had to deal with angry parents. When the academy had closed for 3 weeks, the kind man had to deal with angry parents then too. Most of the civilian parents put their children in public school for a reason. Their children got the chance to be pampered, and that just wasn't going to happen, at least not in his school if it could be helped. Some civilians realized that becoming a ninja wasn't easy, though it was a lucrative position if you lived long enough, and children expecting to be hand-fed were cut pretty much from the get-go. The young man could only sigh while rubbing the scar that ran across his nose. It was so easy to become frustrated with the civilians. Yet there were several civies that made damn good shinobi. Genma Shiranui was a good example. He was young, only 25, and was more than likely marry into AC. Lan once Suiren's child was registered as a second-generation bloodline limit. Either way, Genma was well known in ninja circles as unpredictable yet efficient at getting the job done. Chuckling to himself at the idea, he waved at some of the other instructors as he left before turning just outside the academy walls to head toward the hospital. It was odd for him to look up at the hospital. It had been a number of years since this incident that he'd had to see the inside of those ugly walls. Maneuvering through the hallways, Uruka was slightly surprised to find that Naruto had been moved. Generally, people weren't moved from one area of the hospital to the other, but in this case she'd gone from civilian care to the Medi-Nin care, which in his opinion was where she should have gone in the first place. Closing parenthesis. Ah, Tora-san, do you know why Naruto was moved? Uruka asked the Anbu in question. It was good to see that someone was keeping watch over the door. It was a concern that something else might happen to the girl. The Anbu in question simply sent the man several silent hand signals that had Uruka sighing. Apparently Naruto's case was on shutdown and no one was allowed to talk about it. This ultimately meant that if the young teacher wanted information, he would have to talk to the Hokage himself. Which would ultimately mean a lot of waiting, considering how much of a bitch the man's secretary was. Uruka could only shake his head at the idea before slipping past the quiet guard outside to find that both of Naruto's friends had been getting ready to leave. It was only 5 o'clock, but many clans had work for their children even after school closed. Shino was more than likely learning more about the insects he controlled, and while Tenten didn't have a clan, her father owned a well-known store that catered exclusively to nins, and the young girl would avenue to learn how to run it. How was your day? Uruka's smile widened when the two of them jumped in surprise. They probably hadn't heard him come in, which wasn't that surprise. Both of them were still being trained in situational awareness, but it would eventually develop over time. It was good, Yumino-sensei. Shino replied, slipping into a monotone that his family was known for. There was just something about Abarames that when they got nervous they shut down emotionally. Tenten snorted. I've learned more about hospital politics than I ever wanted to know and fully intend to have a debriefing with Da. The girl replied in dry sarcasm, though he could hear some anger in those words as well. Well, I suppose the two of you better be off then. I'll see you in the morning. Uruka wasn't about to say anything to either of them. If Tenten had managed to hear something she wasn't supposed to, then it was a good thing she planned on talking to her father about it. Shino, on the other hand, they were really going to have to see if they could get the boy out of the monotone. On occasion Shibi managed to act like a relatively normal nin, but in comparison to his clan the one who was the most well-known happened to be Muda. The 14-year-old was damned good at what he did and proved it by becoming Chunin this year. Watching the two of them leave, Iruka could only sink into the chair. He spent most of his day standing, and because of that on occasion his legs just ached like nobody's business. Iruka could only close his eyes, and before he knew it, he was out like a light, the Anbu on guard, so no reason to wake man in question. Instead, Tora rearranged the younger man into a more comfortable position before throwing a blanket over him. If the little girl did wake up, at least she would have someone she knew nearby, considering her guardian was currently on a mission because of the Hokage. Tora sighed. Looking over the girl, he knew she was going to change Konoha. The question was how much.